Wow. Well, okay. I will say a few words to bring us into this new space. Uh, Welcome, everyone, to hour 5 of the Connectathon. This is one of the sessions as part of Tools for Transformation. And specifically, our topic for this hour is sovereignty, society, and identity. I'm hoping that this can actually be a fairly free-ranging and multi-dimensional exploration of those things. I'd like to really bring forward and presence the observation that identity means a lot of different things to different people, and that we have different ways of thinking about identity. And then there's the way that identity has been habitually encoded in our digital tooling. And so partly I'm inviting the question of how might we generate that kind of digital tooling that acknowledged and reflected the reality of the ways that we actually think about identity. And so I don't have, a deep thesis about that or a way to, like an answer. It's more of like, can we be with this question? And so when I was inviting people to this session, I was looking for people in, social sciences and psychology and other places, and also, people with, an engineering, software engineering background. And I will disclaim that I am, I'm also working on a digital identity solution that I'm hoping can address some of this, and I'm hoping that it can be a part of the conversation, not necessarily central to it. But if it ends up fitting in, and if my colleague who's working on it ends up showing up to this session, then who knows? We might get lucky enough to get a demo of that. So we will see. And I'm just going to scan who is here, welcoming specifically Norbu, who actually, in bridging us from the last session, is at Holochain. And Norbu and I have had some excellent conversations around exactly these topics, and also how we might be able to plug the work that's being done in this space into work that's being done in the Holochain space. And also want to acknowledge Shikara. I'm not sure how long you've been here. I saw you, I think, in the last session, and now I see you're here. So welcome. I think Shikara is more on the social science side of identity, and he could probably speak more to that. So with that, I am going to, what's this? Sorry, I'm getting a direct message. Going to tap out and ask. Okay. Okay. Oh, that's Tim. That's our Tim? Okay. Great. So yeah, I guess that's maybe just the beginning of the conversation, and maybe just would ask for kind of like reflections, questions. What do you mean? And I'm happy to talk, but I don't want to spend the whole hour talking. So, is there anyone who has thoughts on this topic? Yay, Ferial, to my rescue. Yeah. What do you think?
So it's on this day, you know this. But I think the thing about identity you talk about, or you asked about, I think this is a question we've got to ask. Is it really about the technology, or is it about us really first figuring out what we understand about our identity? Because I almost feel like as we are developing these things, they're really expressions, almost the furtherance of what's happening inside of us. right? It's just the external expression. So the question that I have for us to think about is, what about identity? What about our understanding of this right now is affecting what we are creating? Why it feels so dissonant, why it feels so out of sync with, as you've described, how we naturally vibe, right? And how we actually interact, as opposed to how we stereotypically act, right? There's something we do naturally, and then you see us around our families and around our friends, and then you see us in a Zoom room. And we put on these personas because it's this. Do we have an identity crisis? I have to ask. And how do we address that in order to, so that it flows over into the way we're designing our technologies?
Yeah, exactly. Great questions. I have responses, but I want to pass it to Norbu.
Well, it's okay if you want to respond first. I'll be here. I mean, no threat.
Okay, sure. I mean, yeah, I think the answer, I mean, and perhaps it's a rhetorical question, so like we can be with the question. But the answer that kind of is bubbling up for me is like, well, yes. Like, yeah, there's an identity crisis for sure, like without a doubt. And I think that, partly it's, not to pathologize it, because I really think it's about kind of integrating these different pieces. But there's this really excellent book. What's it called? It's called Societies and Organizations or something like that. I will get the reference later. But really excellent book. There was a survey basically that took place inside a bunch of IBM around the world. So they were transnational corporation, and so they had and they had the same kind of book, the same portfolio, the same rules, the same structures. Everything was the same everywhere. So this created a really interesting research opportunity, which was that when they went to study what was going on in the social dynamics in these places, everything else being the same, the differences that were observed could be assumed fairly safely to be cultural differences. And so then it created a little bit of a kind of a control because of how uniform the IBM systems were around the world, right? The IBM kind of corporate structures. And so, they found really significant differences in what's called power distance, in individualism versus collectivism, and a number of different things. And I think this has everything to do with the way that we see ourselves. Do we see ourselves fundamentally as being part of a collective first, or do we see ourselves fundamentally as like individuals first? And if I was in this workshop, We Will Dance with Mountains with Bayo Akomolafe. And one of the things that he was talking about was, well, what are the totems of whiteness, or the totems of white supremacy? Well, it's like the individual. The individual is like the idol of this particular way. It's very strong. It's very dominant globally. And I think we're seeing it's kind of like an inflammation of this particular potential. Now, I think there's something beautiful and powerful about the individual. Okay. But I also think that we're seeing kind of like an inflammation. It's like an overgrowth of this particular kind of energy. And it's that kind of energy that I think ends up getting encoded into these very big, monolithic, central, absolutist sort of conceptions of identity. And which, like, if we were to go down this other path, like, we would see encoded into the like single monolithic global blockchain of Ethereum, where your one verifiable identity exists or something like this. I think it's absolutely a terrible idea. And where I think something like Holochain comes into play is that the sense of reality that's being maintained is being maintained in a peer-to-peer way, which is more like the way that we actually maintain our sense of self in our actual relations with actual people. And whether those are extended networks of people like-minded around the world, or whether they are very much like physically local close networks, the closeness or intimacy of the actual connection is the thing that builds up the emergent identity, right? And so that's the kind of model of identity that I am interested in supporting technologically. And so anyway, sorry, I know that was a big kind of like long riff on that, but I wanted to respond. And And now I'll yield to Norbert.
Yeah, so I think both of you have great points, and I want to talk to you. Is it Fariel? Fariel? Okay, Fariel. I want to speak to your point, which is that question, right? Do we have an identity crisis? It's so like that curiosity is important because to me, I'm currently working on ways to tell the story of identity for everybody. Because in this room, we have a lot of people who are very interested and focused and concerned and aware of sovereignty and agency and centralization and decentralization. But my mom doesn't know anything about all that stuff. And she still knows there's an issue with the current way that things happen. And so in telling that story, I'm just kind of looking at that the curiosity and question that you're saying is important in telling the story because it takes us out of the head of the person that already is really in depth involved in this. And yeah, is there a crisis? I think it's really interesting. Just the idea of centralization and decentralization is interesting because we're talking about centralized power, and then we're talking about moving the centralized power to a bunch of equally decentralized nodes of power, which both are in opposition of sovereignty, really, because sovereignty is an individual thing. And so in a decentralized world, you have a different relationship with classical sovereignty because you're able to return sovereignty to maybe a community of individuals or a smaller group that's not beholden to a large centralized power. All of these concepts are interesting and important now because we have new technology, because blockchain and because cryptocurrencies have unleashed and proved the power of cryptographic signatures to remove middlemen, which causes a different question. If we don't have to have AWS because we can have a centralized system, a decentralized system that provides the same utility and rewards people directly without utility and resource being funneled off to some massive corporation, that's a really compelling proposition. It's really an interesting idea because then that's a huge amount of energy that's returned to the people in the network instead of supporting a monolithic massive entity that's separate. Yeah, these are some of my thoughts. I think it's a really compelling time, and identity plays into that as the key. The reason that I wouldn't say crisis, we have an identity opportunity because we have new technology, we have new ways to relate to each other without intermediaries, and it's just a matter of constructing. To me, it's just a matter of constructing and organizing these technologies in a way that is secure and safe, easy to access, and flexible enough to leverage existing systems and also pave a road into a more decentralized future. And yeah, that's to me that technology combined with telling this story, the story of how identity matters because it returns sovereignty and agency to individuals. That's the kind of key. It's not maybe a crisis, but it is a huge opportunity for us to stop relying on monolithic mega corporations to give us permission to be humans in a digital space.
Thanks, Nobu. I noticed, Fariel, you've got your hand up, and Shikara, I want to hear what you have to say. Something that came up with as far as kind of the concept of sovereignty, the idea that the sovereignty is in the individual. I think there's an interesting inquiry here because I remember in the previous session that I think it was Art, might have been Matthew, used this phrase mutual sovereignty. And so this is like actually part of the inquiry for me is like, does sovereignty necessarily reside in what we think of as the individual? But I think another point that you kind of bring up that's really, really interesting is the way in which the massive centralization of power and the massive sort of centralized information architectures, although they kind of purport to be and might be driven by this like concept of the individual, actually end up obliterating the individual, like in the model. There's an irony there that's very interesting, and I'll leave it there and try not to ramble. And I guess it looks to me like the way the order is here is Ferial.
Yes.
Okay.
No, I was saying, I love what you said about telling the story, because there's a question from Tariq in the chat asking about where restorative justice would fit into something like this. So I was in a session where he was kind of talking about the Khoi and the San people. So, for example, I really think there's something about understanding our ancestry, understanding. So, for example, the Khoi and the San people were, we now know that they are the original ancestor of all of humanity, and they held peace, because they were this kind of negotiating people. So they held peace for thousands of years, right? So here we are. If we don't understand that, we don't learn from, and that means restoring the justice to the people who now hold some of that DNA, some of that, I want to say sense making, some of that wisdoms, right? And bring it into how we then design what we design, because it's firstly understanding our own identities. And the question was, he's talking about, is it therein, do we understand some of our sovereignty maybe a little bit more when we understand where we actually come from, because somewhere in the kind of moving through various different eras and the kind of cultural evolutionary process, we lost some of those, some of our connection to that. And we're still in our DNA, we're still responding to some of it, as we mentioned earlier, in our smaller groups of people and how we relate to one another in an earlier session. But when we start to build our tools and technologies and things like this, we tend to lose that. So really is more about an exploration of understanding who we are better, and then building from that place.
Thank you, Ferial. Shikara?
Yeah, fantastic, Ferial. I really like your point there. I work for an organization that specializes in human identity and how it works from a sort of psychosocial system perspective. And what I'm really interested in is bringing that sort of human identity, the understanding and the academic research that's been done in various different multidisciplinary fields, to bring it to the digital identity space and to integrate it into that the digital to human interface, so that it's more conducive to how we work as humanity. And so I really resonate with your point, Ferial. And it's a lot of the research is now pointing towards human identity being a generative narrative identity. So it's told through stories, and we make sense of the world through stories. So there's also that link there with your point, Norbu. Yeah, really exciting to be here and listening in this. Thanks.
So I've been invited in the chat to clarify the conversational prompt again, and I was invited to do it succinctly, and I'm not sure if I've ever done anything succinctly in my entire life. But I will make an effort once again. Welcome, Brad. I'm glad you could make it. So yes, the prompt is, how can we, what kind of digital tooling would help support us in a more authentic expression of what our identities, plural, really mean to us? Maybe that's it. Okay, thanks. And Shikara, if you want to respond, feel free. I see that your hand is still up. It may or may not be a mistake. Okay. Anyone? Yay, Tariq.
Thanks, Dave. Maybe just adding a little bit of nuance to what was said before, really well articulated by Ferial. I think my question is, as one sort of looks to a better world, generally speaking, through a digital framework that as we've been discussing, kind of goes through these particular processes of the usefulness of deconstruction and the decentralization of power and how it relates to sovereignty. How does one address 500 years of a particular kind of system that has pretty much extracted and eviscerated indigenous knowledge systems? Where is the intentionality of accountability, which would also posit one towards not just placating white supremacy towards necessarily a kind of, an inflamed sense of individuality, but that it was actually part of a particular system of oppression that that has been in operation for so long that its residues pretty much sink within any DNA of any kind of terrain that we're speaking of, any sort of architecture, whether it's in the digital realm, across intersectional academic research, physically, political, and how it's manifest in geopolitical boundaries and so. So the question is, with the intentionality of, of moving towards this better place as we are deconstructing. As we are deconstructing and decentralizing along the way, to what extent is there a centering of restorative justice, which needs to be calibrated and formulated in a way that it almost travels with the inquiry and is not sort of perennially relegated as a kind of byproduct of intention, but that the recuration and cultivation and sustaining of IKS as it was lost, including territories, physical territories of land, resources, and then the intangible heritage resource that has been lost over time. What kind of architectural framework, would it be that actually centralizes that in terms of healing as it's, as a priority, but quite specific in terms of undoing the colonial project?
I think it's a great question, Tariq, and I want to sit with it a little bit more. It's actually interesting. I feel like the answer to the question, in a way, fits better in what I was imagining for hour 8, which is the healing biotopes and frontiers of human ecology session, because I really think it ultimately has to do with like land back, and has to do with really being able to put roots into the living earth. And like to talk about like restorative justice is like all basically emptiness unless it is restoring actual, and you mentioned territories. So I mean, that's my personal frame on it. And I think like ultimately the larger project is the re-indigenation of like the entire species. So I'll just kind of leave it there and not attempt to answer the question. I think it's a really good one to be with. And Kimberly.
Hi, thank you. I'm sitting on the land of the Kikuyu here in Nairobi in Kenya. I think my question probably follows the same lens as Tariq's, which is, it's really easy to talk about identity in terms of like the digital if we're not incorporating and understanding the all-encompassing presence of what you might call whiteness, which I like to describe as systemic trauma, and the fact that we have inherited systems that have systemically oppressed and subsumed and obliterated other cultures. And because the majority of us do grow up within a, well, not the majority, we can't say the majority, that's a very generalized statement, but when we look at people who, let's just say, have access to digitization or are creating the world with new tech, that new tech has been created through a framework of colonialism and capitalism mainly. And through colonialist education systems, which are linear. Meanwhile, Indigenous education systems are non-linear and circular. It's like even to the way in which we're on the Zoom call and the way that it's visually represented is not, we can't say for sure. We don't know how somebody who was fully educated in, you know, a SAN system might have created this had they never been educated in by Western education, right? Or Eurocentric education. And so it's really difficult then to talk about identity and sovereignty because our identity and our sovereignty has been dictated to us by these monoliths. And even when we look at the monoliths of corporate, it's not about just corporate, it's about the education system, it's about academia, it's about the fact that academia is based in a cognitive understanding of the world as opposed to a felt understanding of the world, that it disembodies us. And those are very, very different experiences. And they're still often poo-pooed. It's like somebody saying, oh, the research shows that we understand ourselves through storytelling. And it's not meant to be as a slight to Chikara, I hope that's your name. Of course, that's how we understand the world. And yet it takes somebody who's from an academic background, usually from a Eurocentric university, to tell us what we've known our whole lives, that storytelling is how we understand ourselves. That's like the first way that we relate to our children is to tell them a bedtime story. But because some, you know, person with a PhD's now just done the research by asking mothers who will not be credited for their feedback into that research, for their unique perspective on how storytelling helps them in their connectivity to their children. And that is, but it then centers the research academic getting their PhD. The emotional labor of both women and Indigenous communities in terms of maintaining this planet and understanding this planet is just totally subsumed all the time. I'm off on a bit of a rant now, hope you excuse me, because that's what's missing. We understand that 80% of our remaining biodiversity on this planet is maintained and has been upkept by Indigenous communities, and yet they are perpetually under threat. They're being killed in their hundreds. And we don't have the technology to support that. So how are we meant to support human diversity, not even like biodiversity in the larger planetary scale, but Indigenous human diversity? Because we live mainly, when we're in these digital landscapes, in a bubble of whiteness or systemic trauma, which is created by Eurocentric systems that don't allow for an Indigenous perspective, even within the way that we're visually represented. And that's not just in who's attending this conversation, but how this conversation is represented aesthetically. And so it's really like easy and simple to talk about these things as abstract concepts, but they build our lives in the unseen and program us to think that we all just conveniently sit in a little square box. And yet all of us have got like, you know, like these very coutured, safe, Eurocentric perspectives that aren't representative of the diverse visual culture, even within these blocks of what is going on the planet. And so, and then also when you're looking at designing systems and you look at even just the male and the feminine, the way that a female is going to design a system is very different to how a male is going to design the system. But depending on how a female is educated and brought into a system that is predominantly patriarchal, the end result is going to be very, very different. And I don't think that when we talk about tech and we talk about the digital, we understand that diversity of perspective or include that diversity of perspective. It's like most people can't access this conversation. Most people haven't got enough data in Southern Africa to be able to access this conversation. And so how are we then going to access diversity of identity? And we need diversity of identity in order to create the human weavings that we need to basically maintain humanity, because having monolithic approaches to identity and understanding the world is what's killing us, literally. Thank you.
Thank you, Kimberly. I emphatically agree with you. And I think it's just really interesting just in terms of the very last thing that you said, because I think it wove back to so much of the others. It's like, look, I think many people are increasingly having the understanding that, you know, all tech is human, that all technology is socio-technology, that there's this kind of cultural element that's being embedded into the technology, and that the current drivers of technological development, which tend to be coming out of, you know, asymmetries in informational and financial power, like these concentrations of power, and are perpetuating that then because they build the models and then everybody else has to kind of like fit inside of those models, I think exacerbates these problems. So if you take the approach that, like, if you were going to, let's just say, like, a person wishes that they want to make tools for all of humanity, and all of humanity is very diverse and has lots of different perspectives. So then those are all of your stakeholders. Those are, you know, in the language of software development, those would be all of your stakeholders. But how do you actually access? How do you actually communicate with? Are you capable of hearing, from all of these stakeholders? So I think that it's necessarily something that involves. One of the things that's come up a lot in many of the communities, like online communities that I'm in, is that we'll be discussing issues that involve stakeholders that aren't in the spaces where the conversations are taking place. And this is the kind of the last thing you said. And actually, sometimes that is actually, so one thought would be, oh, you need to bring them in. You need to make the spaces welcoming or something like this. Just taking an example of, like, you know, some of my like permaculture friends on their community land projects, actually they don't want to be here. Okay, they want to be out in the field with their hands in the dirt, and they want to be doing the things that they do. Okay, it doesn't make them not stakeholders in the stuff that we're building, because it's like shaping the world and it's shaping our relations and it's shaping the culture and all of this. They're definitely stakeholders, but they don't want to be here. So there's this real necessity that we have probably multiple layers in a web of kind of advocacy where we're connecting, where we're bridging people in. So for example, you have like a really strong feeling about this and you want this to happen and you feel capable of a certain amount of bridging. If you know 20, 30, 40, a Dunbar's number of people that are stakeholders in the big picture sense of it, but who don't have access to these conversations or don't want to participate in them because of who they are and how they are and what their authentic life really looks like, then, you know, that then ends up being a function. A really important function is that bridging function, how we can like bring this information in and listen to each other so that more of, all of the human and more than human stakeholders in the whole living matrix of the earth can start to be included in, the design process of the technology. I mean, I 100% agree that this is not what has been happening, and that we're only now starting to learn that this is what needs to happen, and starting to identify what could we do in order to help more of this happen. And I see that Brad has raised his hand, so I will pass to you, Brad.
Hi, everybody. Sorry for being a little bit late. Yeah, Kimberly, obviously great points. I think speaking as a white male, Western developer, what drives me is that there is a huge portion of humanity that wants what you want. And even if I'm I'm not indigenous, I want to work on tools that will empower indigenous people and other marginalized communities. And I think the way to do that, the way that motivates me is to claim agency for that large community. And to do that through tools that get us out of the systems that don't care about those communities. And I think that I'm working a lot with Day and others on tools that that will essentially, hopefully, empower us to create systems that allow those communities to be full-on participants as opposed to marginalized. So I can't actually, be indigenous, but I hope to build tools that will make it easier for them to be, part of the whole.
Thanks, Brad. Shikara, and then Ferial.
Yeah, so I just wanted to respond to Kimberly as well, that the academic look into how we construct identities. The narrative component is just one component of it, where we really look at the deeper needs that are driving our identity positions, right? The universal needs. And those understandings gives us a window into how we operate underneath our subconscious. We can understand what's driving us to be polarized. The research was actually in the conflict transformation space. What's driven two different groups of people to violent conflict? What are the root causes of it? And then when you look at it, it's the sort of the narrative structures within a group that's configured in a certain way that's leading to conflict, and that certain reduction of narrative options then lead to extreme othering. All of these findings are really interesting things that then bring peace to the world and provide agency to whoever is being trained or have been given the power to utilize human identity. And so I understand your point, but I think there is some positives that come out of the research, especially if that research is then applied in practice. And that's why I'm really keen to work with the digital identity space, because I think that's where the intersection is, and that's where the positive impact is for millions, if not billions of people moving into the next decade or so.
Thanks, Shikara. Ferial?
Thank you, Shikara. I agree with you there. And I think the other part of it is we need to ask ourselves these very important questions and deep questions like what Kimberly has posed and others here, because otherwise we don't think about it and we don't think about how we will respond to that. We don't have to have an answer in this moment, but we need to sit with this because this is really important. And what I'm also thinking about is this is complex. So in other words, it doesn't mean that in this moment we can solve that, because these are, as I think it was Tariq that mentioned, 500 years, 600 years, thousands of years, of such wisdom that was lost to us because of the way that we've operated in the past. So I think what I'm trying to ask us here again is to think about how do we begin to think about a more integral approach? Because we can talk about technology as, computer programs and things like that, but really technology, if we truly understand the deeper definition of that, is not related only to computer programs and tech, but actually to the systems that we design, the processes that we design, products, whatever, that makes our lives, I guess, run and work the way that it does, right? Forms the cultures that we're a part of or informs it. And so I wonder if we have to ask ourselves about different technologies that have to kind of come together, you know, and work together to I think what Chikara was saying a little bit, he mentioned specifically about the cultural development part and technology, but there's so much more to this, right? There's a web of interconnected, I want to say, conversations that have to be taking place, because you're talking about education, you're talking about, you know, just what we've been through, all our trauma as a culture. We're talking about the way we do our politics. You know, there's just so much there that has to be considered. So it's very important that when we're looking at addressing an aspect of this, that we're trying our best to look at it from an integral approach, where we're actually not, you know, trying to find solutions in silos, because then it's impossible to find those solutions. And also to have grace for ourselves, because we're not going to find those solutions overnight. But I think it's that point of that we're actually invested and committed to doing so.
Thank you, Fariel. Kimberly. Oh, you're muted still.
Personally, I just find it rather sad that listening to this, like, all of these solutions exist within Indigenous culture, and they're well known, and they're well discussed, and they're well understood. And they've existed and managed to maintain themselves for thousands of years within particular Indigenous groups and communities. And yet, there's a certain element of reinventing the wheel. It's like we do have ritual and ceremony. We do have rites of passage. We know all about council meetings and circling and long format conversation and storytelling. And the people that have maintained those things don't seem to be here. And why is that? Why aren't we going to our Indigenous elders and speaking to them and paying them for their wisdom and their time? Because there's nothing wrong with that. There's everything right with it. And yet it seems way beyond us to get down on our knees and say, we're sorry. We understand that you are sitting on, are displaced from your land, that you don't even have stakeholdings in the land that you've been dispossessed from. And yet we want you to have stakeholdings in tech that might not primarily serve you because you're too busy looking after the trees. I do just personally find it incredibly sad. I'm sitting here as a white woman who's a Sangoma, which is a traditional Zulu doctor, which is a title that I'm totally allowed to have. And I've been trained in some of the most ancient Indigenous pathways of this planet. And yet I'm known to everybody here, or to a lot of people here. I can direct you to a lot of the rituals and cultures and identities in the ways that we created form and meaning in society and family systems through birth and death and trauma and rebirth. These things are not lost. They're overlooked. They're silenced. They're dismissed as nonsense up until like 5 minutes ago. I'm not angry.
Yeah.
I'm just saying.
No, I feel it. I feel the pain, and I share the pain. And I think that in this particular group, like I imagine, and my sense is that in this group, we're all committed to, being with this question of like, yeah, how do we do it? Like, how do we unlearn, and how do we relearn, and how do we connect those things? And that's what we're here for. So. One of the things that came up for me just when, because I'm also kind of following along in the things being dropped in the chat, and about technology not only being like what we often, call technology. And I think this is true. You know, culture is a technology, language is a technology, and the things that you're mentioning are certainly technologies. And I just read an article recently that was about, basically it was like ChatGPT in Japanese is awful because it like takes the Japanese and translates it badly to English and then runs it through ChatGPT and then generates a response in English and then translates it into bad Japanese. And and it completely misses interesting different things about the linguistic structure and its relationship to the conceptual structure and the view of the world that would be native to it if it had actually been trained in Japanese on a Japanese canon and the LLM was in Japanese. And in thinking about that, it reminded me of a thing where I didn't get deeply into it, but I was very intrigued to look at it, and I'll drop the link in here. It's on indigenous AI, and it essentially has to do with work that is being done to encode these systems of traditional ways of knowing, into what we're calling AI, and really the larger kind of frame there is that there's not just a singular intelligence, that we're talking about multiple intelligences that come from different ways of seeing the world, and this is this kind of like participatory turn. Somebody mentioned integral earlier, and I think it was you, Ferial, and one of the things about like kind of first wave transpersonal psychology was, and we maybe all remember fondly, maybe when we first got like Joseph Campbell or something else, where it was like honoring the truth, these different common threads of truth from all the traditions around the world. Interesting sneaky thing there was that it imported whiteness and colonialism and patriarchy into the model, and monotheism even, as it was kind of mining all of these cultures for the common pieces that could be assembled into the one big integral view. And it was still sneakily kind of objectivist and monolithic, and it's because it was operating on this old system, this old way of thinking. And so kind of second wave transpersonal psychology, brought in by the person who really kind of first articulated it that way was Jorge Ferrer, who's one of the professors at California Institute of Integral Studies. So there's really interesting stuff there, but basically that it has to do with this participatory dialogue of allowing all of these different perspectives to exist as being complete in themselves, as opposed to being sources of kind of raw materials for the assembly of the one big perspective. And I, just to feed that back in, as this kind of like Western white patriarchal colonial like view of kind of science, as if like we're discovering the one truth and we're assembling the one big model of the one truth, we might think about artificial intelligence, or even think about our own identities, like to bring it back to that, as being singular. Whereas, people like Marvin Minsky, father of artificial intelligence in many ways, in his kind of seminal book Society of Mind, or like going back to psychology, thinking about like James Fadiman and his Symphony of Selves, or looking at internal family systems, or any of these other models that show that we are in fact ourselves communities. Like ourselves are in fact actually just emergent phenomena that are happening because of the action of all of the communities that are participating in this thing here. And that the boundaries that we're creating are actually kind of somewhat arbitrary. There's like a universal holon kind of here. So I think in that same way, if you look at the brain case doesn't have a single brain in it. It has actually lots of different little brains in it. All the different little organs, it's just about as diverse as the gut. We don't think about the gut as being a single organ, but we somehow think of the brain as being a single organ, and then put this monolithic sense of self in it. Whereas in fact, it's this ongoing conversation. That's what's actually going on. And so then the better and more advanced kind of view of what would be artificial intelligence, it wouldn't be singular at all. It would be intelligences, and it would be about this dialogue. And I think that that's actually where we're going. And I think we are learning this, and we're stumbling towards grace as I think Matthew said in the last call. So I will pause there so that I can read the comments and yield the floor to Norbu.
Yeah, this is a really vigorous discussion. I'm interested in what it's bringing up for me. I feel vulnerable in my heart. I feel challenged. I can feel the sadness that you feel in the ways that I'm aware of it. I don't know as much specifically, Kimberly, about the ways that you were speaking of it, but I'm hearing in your voice and in your presentation the passion and wholehearted feeling you have. And yeah, I'm not a developer. I'm a product manager, and I am white. And it's just interesting that this conversation, and I'm male, and other than that, you don't know anything about me or what ancient wisdom I carry or who I study with. And so it's interesting. This whole thing is interesting. Being in a square and not being able to feel each other or be in the room with our electromagnetic fields touching, like all of that is very interesting to me. And I think I want to respond just by saying, I agree with you. I think these things are critically important. And just like every other product that I manage, I will not let perfection be the enemy of good. And like, I will continue to build what I can and solve the problems I can and continue to listen and continue to iterate and improve. Like, that's the only way I know to go forward. And that's on myself and inwardly and on the products that I build and the software that I manage and contribute to. And I can speak for Holochain that's very much the culture that we have internally. It's a diverse and very thoughtful and inclusive culture, and these subjects matter here.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Norbu. I just want to acknowledge that we're approaching the hour. We do still have some time, so no stress. But I would love to invite in any voices that we haven't heard from. There's been a very beautiful and lively and rich conversation amongst the people who have spoken, but I'd be interested to hear from some people who have not yet spoken, if anyone wants to step forward.
I was up north.
Yeah, Dylan, yes, please.
I was up north in Argentina. I live in Argentina. And I was up north 2 weeks ago. And all of a sudden, they've taken away from all the indigenous people that have lived on that land forever. They've taken away the land for the lithium, because it's one of the biggest centers of natural lithium in the world. Argentina, Chile, and Bolivia is the area. So, and it's all politics, completely. They don't give shit about the land or who it belongs to, or they just take it away from the people. Now, those are the problems we have, because it still happens. So, and it's no offense to anybody. It's where we focus on. It's where we sit down and say, what can I do to live in a better world? And we're all doing this, but the realities are like completely different. We were listening to Africa today, to Asia, it's the meeting, Alex, the meeting is incredible, because we're all over the place. It's incredible. But I mean, I've worked in marketing and advertising for 45 years. I built Coca-Cola campaigns. I've made campaigns for Camel. And I said, fuck, what did I do? Well, I learned what I have to change in order to be able to do something on this planet to make it happen. But there's a lot of shit going out there that's overwhelming. you know, Latin America is a region in the world like Africa, like Asia, that the big corporations and banks have gobbled us up. So you want to get back onto a tennis court and try to play a ball game with one of these guys? It's fucking impossible. But I say, no, it's not impossible. Let's keep working on it. But where do you work from? For me is the question. You know, each one of us independently, like what you just said, Norbert, that, you know, you believe that what you build and what you're constructing and where you're working is right, and you don't cheat on anybody, and you're doing it right. I think we're all doing that. The thing here is, and I think one of the reasons of this meeting has to do with when each of us go back home, what do we take away from this meeting in order to be able to build a better day tomorrow? That's it.
Thank you, Dylan. I agree. And we have a few minutes, although I noticed that as we got to about this point in the last one, the pattern seemed to be to invite a little bit of spaciousness because the hours are back to back. And so at this point, it's like 4 minutes until the beginning of the next one. So maybe we just wrap this here. And we only got maybe about 30 seconds of breathing in between sessions that Alexander was leading us on last time. So maybe we'll leave ourselves a few more seconds this time. And I just want to say once again, thank you to everyone for participation in this session. And I look forward to seeing you in some of the other sessions. And I'll just put in a teeny little plug for the other one that I'm hosting during hour 8 on healing biotopes and frontiers of human ecology, which I hope is going to be at least as beautifully rich as this was. Thanks.